I was working on a drawing and I needed this Rapidograph, and unfortunately I don't use Rapidographs that often, so it had dried up and I had to clean it. Ed and I were talking about cleaning these Rapidographs recently, so I thought I would just do a quick video of the breakdown of a Rapidograph pen. This is basically taking apart as much as I know how to take it apart in order to clean it, and I have cleaned it all off with warm water. I've dried it all, and now I'm going to put it back together and then make a drawing. So first piece, this is the wire. This is what actually delivers the ink down the pen barrel. This barrel is actually hollow. You know, it's kind of like a pipe that goes through. So insert this. You have to be careful not to bend the wire. This is a pretty big Rapidograph, so it's not as big of a deal, and you may be able to see that wire coming through there and just sticking out a little bit. I'm not sure what this plastic cap does exactly. It's kind of like a reservoir. It may help the ink not to spill out at this stage. That's something that frequently happens. And then the assembly is just screwed in. You can see that black powder is the dried ink that is on the threads that I am screwing this inner piece into. Yeah, you can see this is all threaded. So the way these pens assemble is just by basically screwing together the various pieces. So this is your pen nib. And once you get that in there as tight as you can finger tighten, there's a tool that comes with the Rapidograph kits that'll kind of snaps on, fits on snugly, and then you can just kind of turn it another little, that wasn't much at all, but just kind of to snug it up as best you can, because ink will overflow and leak out of this area, and that's a pretty common experience with Rapidographs. So you want to do the best you can there with getting that tight. I have already filled up the ink reservoir, and I'd use the waterproof drawing ink. This is Koh-i-Noor, the same name brand as the Rapidographs. This is the ink that is sold or comes with Rapidographs usually when you buy them. This is just a larger container. Pen fits snugly in there. Once again, screw the reservoir on tightly, but not too tight. I have cracked barrels, this being the barrel part. I have cracked this by over tightening, and there's no ink issue back here anyway. The ink will leak out of this spot or up here. And that's it. That's your Rapidograph cleanup and reassembly. This is a size 4, 1.20. This is the largest line that comes in the Rapidograph set that Ed and I were talking about recently. So I am going to go and draw now. Usually whenever I'm doing a big drawing like this, I start out with sketches. These are all very tiny. They're on 8.5 by 11 printer paper, so those sketches are, 1 or 2 inches in size. Just something quick to kind of work out the composition. This drawing includes a title logo. Basically, it's like a comic book cover. So I draw in that logo first. I'm using a French curve and Rapidograph pens here. The French curves feature a beveled edge. They're like rulers or straight edges except with a curve. They're designed to do a very neat line that happens to not be a straight line, but you want that edge to be very sharp and crisp. So in addition to the logo, I'm using it also for this character's blades that come out of his arms. I'm inking this with a sable hair brush. This particular one is a Raphael 8404 size 2.
It's very comparable to the Winsor Newton Series 7 brushes. Sable hair brushes are kind of the staple of 20th century comics art, particularly inking. They allow you to vary your line weights, to do feathering. It's a versatile tool. It's a fairly quick tool to use, and it was very popular whenever comics needed big, thick, heavy black lines for reproduction purposes. I'm using Dr. P.H. Martin's high carb black ink. It's waterproof, archival, and very dark black. Inks vary quite a bit in how thick they are and how black and opaque they are. I tend to ink all over the place. I start out in some area of the composition that I don't think is too important, so I can get a feel for how the ink, brush, and paper are working. Once I feel fairly confident, then I start inking the most important details. In this case, if you noticed, I started with the hand and also with the face, and I just kind of go back and forth and work all over the composition. I try to do that so that the finished piece looks pretty even all around and doesn't look like I spent too much time on one part and not enough time on another part. Thing to be aware of there is wet ink. There's a couple of smudges on here where I put my hand into wet ink, so you have to be aware of what you just inked and avoid running your hand over top of that. For a drawing with a lot of blood and grime and grit, it's not too big of a deal to smudge the ink a little bit. Grips is a character from the 80s. It was published in 1986 by Silverwolf Comics, a black and white publisher out of Sacramento, California. 1986, of course, was like the apex year of the black and white explosion, which started with the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles' success in 1984. Took publishers and self-publishers and artists a couple of years to kind of really come on full. So 1986 is, I think, the year where you see the most of this stuff being published and coming out and creating a glut. You know, it's a black and white explosion followed by the black and white implosion that follows because there's just so many of these comics and a lot of them aren't very good. I've been gathering 1986 comics materials together for a possible zine of some sort, or I don't know, some kind of project or another. I find that year fascinating. I started reading comics in probably 1988, so everything I know about 1986 I've learned from a historical standpoint. Besides being the apex of the black and white explosion and self-publishing, it's also an exceptional year for mainstream comics. Frank Miller's Dark Knight Returns came out in 1986. His collaboration with David Mazzucchelli on Daredevil Reborn was the beginning of 1986. Watchmen begins publication in 1986. Elektra Assassin and Batman Year One starts at the end of 1986. So it's a great year for the mainstream comics. It's also noteworthy for art comics and alternative comics in that Art Spiegelman's Pulitzer Prize-winning graphic novel Mouse is completed and published in 1986. Which is part of the movement of comics and graphic novels into bookstores. So it's a great year for comics from a historical standpoint, and I've been delving into that. So if you're interested in that, right now I've just been posting things that I find on my Patreon, and you can find a link for that below as well. Silverwolf Comics published a lot of books in a short amount of time. They stopped publishing in 1987, and then they resume again a year or so later as Greater Mercury Comics. There's also a brief period whenever they publish under the imprint Venetian Press. Their big breakout book, their big title was Grips, and Grips is a violent vigilante. You see he has a claw coming out of his arms, basically like Wolverine, but with one claw instead of three. It started out being drawn by young Ron Lim. He drew 4 pages of it. I don't know if it wasn't right or if they decided they had a better book for Ron Lim to draw, but that stuff was discarded initially, and a new artist was brought on, young Tim Vigil. Anybody that follows our channel here has probably heard us talk about Tim Vigil. He is known for the book Faust, a very violent, over-the-top, X-rated kind of comic, something that we call outlaw comics, and I would draw everyone's attention to a video that we made called Outlaw Comics. There'll be a link below this video. You can check that out, and it kind of looks at what we consider to be outlaw comics, what makes an outlaw comic, and some examples of that kind of stuff. Basically, it's black and white comics that have some degree of obsession visible in the art combined with very violent artwork and subject matter. One of the cool things about Grips, the character in the comic book, is his alter ego when he's not being a violent vigilante of the night is a comic book artist. And in the comic, he draws another comic book called Fat Ninja, which Silver Wolf also published. So you can actually read that, and it's kind of an interesting conceit. I'm surprised there aren't more comic books that do something along those lines. The other innovation that Silver Wolf Comics brought to the market was computer lettering. Chris Silver, the publisher, writer, creator of most of the Silver Wolf comics, was using a Macintosh computer in the mid-'80s and was one of the first examples of comic books that I have seen that feature that distinct lettering style. So here you see the finished piece. It's 11 by 17 inch Bristol board. It was about a 2-hour process drawing this piece. You can like, follow, and subscribe Cartoonist Kayfabe below. Be sure to click the notification icon so you won't miss any new video uploads. We tend to upload 2 to 3 videos a week. You can support Cartoonist Kayfabe and get yourself Cartoonist Kayfabe merch through our spread shop. There's a link below the video for that as well. Thank you for watching, and remember, read more comics.